Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm excited to get us started on our 11:30 presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed the long break and got some coffee. As a reminder, after this session, we're gonna have a 90-minute lunch break. Lunch is gonna be in the Expo Center, which when you go out of this room, you're gonna turn left and go under a bridge and up an escalator. It's like an underground bridge tunnel, I guess. You got it. You'll find it, it's very obvious. And the expo is going to be open until 6:30. We also have our welcome reception from 5 to 6:30, so definitely check that out. If you have any questions, you can come see me after. Keynotes are going to start at 2 p.m. And then just a final reminder, if you did get scanned, if you didn't, make sure you do, and make sure to complete that survey afterwards. Without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce Corey Jessen, who is going to speak on cyber risk quantification, and he is from Verizon. So Corey, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this session right before lunch. We'll make sure we're done on time so everyone can get to eating. I know that's important. So we're going to talk about cyber risk quantification and whether or not this is something that you really should be thinking about. So before I get started, I'm going to issue a couple of warnings. First, I'm going to have some math in here, so if you're afraid of math, I'm going to keep it basic: addition, subtraction, multiplication, nothing too complicated. Second, I do have 2 kids, 7 and 10, so if there's a dad joke there, forgive me, I'm going to use it. So, is cyber risk quantification just a buzz phrase? Well, let's define what a buzz phrase is. You look at dictionary.com, a buzz phrase is a word or phrase often sounding authoritative or technical. It's a vogue term in a particular profession, field of study, popular culture, etc. So, yes, cyber risk quantification is a term we use, it's definitely a buzz phrase, but that's okay. Think about all the things that we use as buzz phrases now. You look at social engineering, how many things in an ishing? We talk about next generation firewalls, Star Trek: The Next Generation. Something new to describe something that's a little bit different that you want to pay attention to. So as we get started, what I first want to do is go over a quick refresher on what risk is, on the basics of risk management, to talk about where we're coming from, and then where we're going to go to. We have 2 basic options I'm going to talk about today. The first is fair, and the second is, we're going to call it not fair. And that's not just something my kids tell me when they're mad at me. And I'll get to what fair is as we get more into that particular piece. So if you don't know what fair is, I will explain it to you. So the idea of risk management is definitely not new. If you've taken any type of course in a CISP or any type of security course, you've heard these things. You've heard different terms like enterprise risk management. You've heard of vulnerability prioritization, information risk analysis, quantitative risk management. Of course, we're talking about cyber risk quantification. And with all this, I like to make up my own phrases or amassing fortunes by reading about incident data. You can always come up with some sort of background to fit whatever you're trying to say. So again, there's a classic risk formula that everyone's probably read before. The risk equals likelihood times impact. And ultimately, that gives you a number. But our objective is never just to reduce a number. When you look at that risk, it talks about what is a specific risk. It tends to be more scenario-based. And then you expand upon that, and you can start talking about the idea of annual loss expectancy and single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. Again, here's your basic math in here, your old risk equations. The problem is when you start looking at these, you have to come up with the numbers. And it's these numbers that make this a very qualitative approach. Anytime you talk about the likelihood of something, that's going to be qualitative. You hear most likely, highly likely, maybe use a 1 through 10 scale. These are all guesses that you're trying to come up with the best possible number that you're trying to quantify. So even though this number is a quantitative number, you get to it through a qualitative approach. And the problem is when you start applying those qualitative approaches, the number you end up with can vary significantly. Think about when you're talking about risk reduction and what is in the risk reduction formulas or your return on investments. Return on investment is ideally a positive number that reflects essentially what percentage you are saving over that annual loss expectancy. But as you start plugging in some numbers here, if you have, say, a $2 million application that has a single loss expectancy of $2 million, if you're off by even 5% at one point in any of these numbers, you could end up from saving $50,000 to losing $20,000 to $25,000. And that's because you've got a qualitative approach to it. You're taking a qualitative number, again, most likely a 1 through 10 scale, and you're turning it into an actual value. And again, it just gets worse as you put more qualitative values in there. So we talk about the annual rate of occurrence. That's a guess number. Is this going to happen 75 or 80% of the time? Is our probability of risk reduction, is it high, is it medium? Is that 65, 70, 80, 20%? The more qualitative values you stack on top of each other, the more off that number gets. And again, this is a single scenario. There's no way you can apply this formula across the board to all different possibilities. So ultimately, the objective is not to reduce each risk. The objective is to drive business decisions. So you need to give the business something they can use to make a decision on what they're going to do. You can't say, we have these 57 risks that we're trying to calculate, and have the business make a decision on which one they're going to prioritize first, because they don't know. There's too many variables involved. So when the business has to make a decision, there are 4 things they can do. They can eliminate it, they can accept it, they can mitigate it, or they can transfer it. You've all seen these before. As professionals, we really like to eliminate and we really like to mitigate risk. Those are the 2 things we're really good at. We don't like the idea of accepting or transferring risk. And I'll give a good example. I had an instructor at one point who did pen testing for a large financial institution. And at one point, he found a vulnerability that existed that an authenticated user could essentially transfer an unlimited amount of money without that transaction being validated. So when he presented this to the CEO, he said, you have to delay this rollout of this application because here's the vulnerability. The CEO asked his staff, how much would you take? And they all came in the neighborhood of tens of millions of dollars. This was a multi-billion-dollar application. CEO said, no, we're going to roll it out. We're going to accept that risk. Now, at the time, that makes perfect sense. The business objective was to support this application that was going to support billions of dollars. But if that analyst had a quantitative method that he could have pointed to and said, here's how we calculate the risk of that, that CEO could have made a more informed decision. Now, he may have made the right one or the wrong one, but he could have made a more informed decision. And that's our ultimate goal, is to make sure that analysts have numbers they can use to inform decision makers and not just their best guess. And we see this with cyber risk quantification. That is the main problem, is even when you have a methodology, whether it's cyber risk quantification or something else, communicating that and having decision makers make a choice based on that data is ultimately the challenge. They have to believe in what you're doing. They have to know that you're not just guessing. There's a methodology behind what you're doing. It doesn't have to be the same methodology across every company, but it does need to be consistent. So cyber risk quantification takes a lot of data. That's one of the big keys. And a lot of us are afraid that we don't have all of the right data. Maybe we don't even know where to start. But as long as you've got some basic security tools in place, you have a starting point. Always start with what you have. Gives you that basis that you can use to start calculating risk. Look at ways to combine that data. And that's one of the big pieces of cyber risk quantification, is combining data from different data sources, not looking at each data point in a vacuum, not looking at your scan results differently than you look at your EDR solution results. So let's look at what the requirements are. And these are going to be very high level. But again, the idea is to aggregate all that data. And this is something that we've been doing in the security industry for a while. We have SIMs. SIMs have been taking in log data for years. We have methods of calculating event responses, event results. We need to do something similar in the area of cyber risk quantification. But to do that, there are 4 basic things we've got to do. And the first is to standardize. We need to have the same methodology across all of the assets. And what often happens is you look at a critical asset and you're going to assess that differently than a less critical asset. The point of cyber risk quantification is to build that into your assessment process. We're not going to use a different method because it's critical than non-critical. We're going to build that into our formula to identify critical assets based on our risk methodology, not just use a different methodology for something that we've deemed as critical. And the second is normalization. We need to normalize all that data we're getting in from tools. Tools have a lot of different numbers that they throw at you. Scanners will come back with a 1 through 5 scale. They'll come back with a 1 through 100 scale. They may use a credit card scale, the 500 to 800 or 1,000 number you see in your credit card. These are all different scales. We have to find a way to normalize that in a way that we can use it in our methodology. You can't just take that raw data and throw that number into whatever you do. It's got to be normalized in some way. Then it needs to be calibrated. Figure out what is weighted more than something else. And again, this is going to depend on a company-by-company basis on what's more important to you. If you do a lot of development work, you may want to put more weight on application development tools. If you do less, you're going to maybe want to put more weight on your network security tools, your endpoint detection tools. It depends on how your organization is structured. And then lastly, there needs to be a continuous monitoring process. This has to be done on a regular basis. It can't just be a set and forget it, do it one time and we're done. Data's got to constantly be fed into a model, constantly be reviewed, and constantly output a new value. Applications change over time. All business processes change over time. Everything changes, and if you're not documenting that change automatically, you're never going to have an updated account of what your current risk is, and you can't communicate that to your decision makers. They can't decide what they want to do because the data they're using is 3, 4, 5, 6 months old. So one of the things that I want to do when we talk about quantification is actually redefine what we mean by assets. Because we're talking about quantification, we look at what is an asset's risk. Historically, when we look at an asset, we talk about a server. It's an application. It's one piece of our environment. In reality, an asset is more than that. It's not just the application. The asset is the whole business process. And if you've done business continuity planning, you've probably done something similar to this in understanding the entire process. You've got to look at the application, not just from the application itself, but where's the source code for that? Do they use open source libraries? What servers is it sitting on? Is it externally facing or is it not? What databases does it talk to? What network devices does it go through? All of these are part of your asset. This is what the risk is on. And there's obviously going to be overlap between multiple assets. If you've got 10 different applications that flow through the same network devices, those network devices are going to exist in all of those different applications. But that's what's key with quantification is understanding those commonalities between those different assets. So let's take, for example, a hypothetical account management application. The purpose of the application is to manage an account of something, some widget. So again, we have the application itself. We're gonna work our way through this. And again, if you've done BCPDR, you may have done some of these things similarly. So you've got the code written by the developers. That's your basic source code. You've got any open source libraries that exist within that code. And again, this is not to say open source is risky. It's just something that's inherently part of the application. It may have API interfaces that are associated with it. That's creating some exposure to it. It has some GUI interfaces that the users are going to access. And then it's supported. It has a server that it sits on. If it's a load balance application, it may sit on multiple servers. If it's cloud-based, it may sit in a container. And then there's some back-end databases. It's going to write to a database somewhere. That database is going to exist. It's going to have some aspects to it. It's either encrypted or not encrypted. It may go to multiple databases depending on the data that's associated with it. And those databases have servers that they sit on or containers that they sit in. So all of these things are part of this application. You need to quantify that entire thing. If you start looking at the individual pieces of it, then you're going to start highlighting risk in areas that maybe is not your primary focus. So once you've done that, then you can start getting to the fun part. And that is actually trying to figure out, well, what is my risk? And the first option is FAIR. If you've heard of FAIR, you may be wondering why we're sitting here, because the idea behind FAIR is doing this, it's calculating your risk. But FAIR is the factor analysis of information risk. The whole institute, FAIR Institute, is out there. It's designed, their initial purpose is to do what's called a taxonomy of risk. If you don't know what taxonomy is, that's essentially using terms to create definitions for what risk is. And what you see on the slide here, we'll cover a few of those. Those are the terms that they use. And if you look at how FAIR describes risk, it's very similar to what I talked about in terms of describing asset as a business process. FAIR calls risk the information or information systems or components that are breached or impaired by a threat agent in a manner whereby its value is diminished or the act introduces liability to the primary stakeholder. So if we look through the different terms here, you can start to see where you have values, where you're going to input some number, like what the cost of a breach or the cost of an incident, how much is it going to cost you. And then you're going to see probability or frequencies. And this is where one of the challenges to FAIR comes in, is because you do have to do a qualitative approach to get a quantitative value. Anytime you're trying to look at these numbers, like the contact frequency, you're looking at how often is a threat agent going to come in contact with the system. And that's different than how, if they come in contact with the system, how likely are they to actually do something? There's not really good numbers behind all of those things. Those are guesses. And then you further start seeing more guesses that come into play, like the threat capability. How good do you think this threat is? Are they an APT or are they a script kiddie? I don't know who's going to exploit this particular thing. Then you've got resistance strength. This isn't Star Wars. This is how good your compensating controls are. How good do you think you are at resisting whatever threat this is? And that's just the left side of that. If you look on the right side of it, you've got what are your secondary loss frequencies. So again, a lot of frequencies go into this. Now, this can be used very effectively, and it has been used very effectively. In a number of different places. And the result of it is very nice. It usually comes out, if you do it correctly, in some sort of dollar value. Decision makers love that. They love being able to say, okay, I have an X million dollar worth of application or business. I'm going to use FAIR. It's going to tell me exactly how much risk I have at stake. And they love that. It's great. So if an executive, as long as they trust that process, you're going to get a good number, or they're going to get a number they're going to use. Question is whether or not you believe it. If the executive trusts you, you need to be able to believe that what you've done is right. But there are some cons to it. FAIR can be very time-consuming. In full disclosure, I am not a licensed or certified FAIR practitioner, so I can't tell you all the details behind FAIR, but having read through all the documentation, having tried to use that methodology, it's hard, it's time-consuming. And the more scenarios you have, the harder it becomes. The places that I have seen it used successfully, the case studies I've read that it is used successfully, tend to be very limited in terms of their scenarios. They're like medical equipment that has a limited number of different attack vectors. Again, there's nothing to say anything's wrong with FAIR, but as you grow as a business, it becomes more and more complicated to use. Things like frequency start to play a piece in it, because you start to become reliant on different data sources for these things like frequency. And these data sources are very good. There's a lot of companies out there that give you a very good number on what a frequency of something is. What we have to keep in mind is whenever someone tells you what the frequency of something is, it's very much like a weather forecast. Meteorologists are good at what they do. They can say there's an 80% chance of rain today, and that percentage applies to a very big geographic area. It could be tens of thousands of square miles, and they're going to be right. There's an 80% chance that the system that we see, 8 times out of 10, it will rain somewhere in that area. Well, it doesn't tell you if it's going to rain on your house. And if you're relying on that number to say this is how frequently something happens, you have to remember that it doesn't tell you just about your business. It's a starting point, but it's not the most reliable of numbers when you're trying to think about everything that goes into your business. If a vulnerability has an 80% likelihood of exploitation, what else fits into that? What about our business is different? Maybe it's only exploited in cases where something else is not available. So there's a lot of things that go into that number that you need to just keep in mind. You don't discard it completely, but keep in mind that there's a lot that goes into that and where you may be different from that number. Let's talk about a second option, something that's a little bit less reliant on the idea of a lot of different probability numbers and trying to use frequency. There's still going to be some qualitative aspects to it. There always is in information security. But we can look at things in a different lens that maybe doesn't lend itself to trying to give the CEO a number. You can still use a dollar value if you really wanted to, but another methodology might work better in trying to communicate that risk to your CEO or to your decision maker. So what we can do is create a base risk. And that risk is made up of the value of the asset, not necessarily the financial value that it is, but you can take that into account. Certainly the revenue generated, the revenue it supports, all of those can go into it. How important that particular asset is to the overall mission. Usually that is related to the revenue supported or generated, but it doesn't have to be. And let's look at the inherent exposure of that asset. We're not looking at the vulnerabilities that exist within it. We'll get to that. But what are the basic inherent risks associated with that, such as, if we look back at our hypothetical example, the number of API connections. That creates risk. Whether or not it's exposed to the internet, an exposed application is going to have more inherent risk than something that's internal. Does it have any regulatory requirements around it? Because even if we've done everything we're supposed to, we think we're managing the risk. If it is exposed to regulatory risk, that's a factor that we need to consider as well. How many users or administrators does it have? How much data does it hold? Does it use open source code? Again, that doesn't make it risky, but it is something that we want to keep in mind. You think of something like Log4j. Log4j was in a lot of open source code, and we need to know that exists within our application when we're assessing what the baseline risk of that is. So what does this ultimately look like? When we're talking about trying to take something and move it into, create some actionable risk for it. So once we've got our base risk score, we need to figure out what else adds to this. What goes beyond that base score that makes it, that's going to help us. And those are things like any agents that are installed. These are your security tools, whether it's EDR, whether it's a scanner, whether it's an SDLC tool, whether it's application scanners, a static or dynamic application scanners, open source scanners, whether it's this on logs. All of these things are your defensive tools. But we're not going to be calculating resistance strength. We're going to be looking at whether your asset is correctly covered by all of these things, and when was the last time that they were assessed. So go through all these. And then ultimately, it comes down to scoring it. So the first thing we do, we have that base risk score that we've figured out based on whatever methodology we use. And I'm not going to give you specific numbers because, again, it's going to depend on an organization. But if you look at the relationships between the different values, and that's what we're talking about here mainly, is relationships between values as opposed to a percentage. We want to say a particular value that we're going to get is 1 or 2 or 1.5 times more important than something else. We're not going to use, this is an 80% likelihood of happening, that's a 70% likelihood of something happening. We want to say that our scan results or the result from this other tool is 2 times more important than the regulatory risk requirement that we have. So that means we probably need to address these things first. But as those vulnerabilities or those findings go down, maybe we need to address the regulatory requirements first. And the same thing on the actionable side. You're going to be adding all of these numbers together based on whatever relationship between the different variables that works best for your business. And once you have that, you're going to combine those into a score. Now, keep in mind on here, some of those variables are things like what's missing. And we're not talking about what things do we not know that we not know. We're talking about what agents are missing from devices that are supposed to have them. Our data is only as good as the data that's going into it. If we have an asset database that lists all of our physical assets or whatever assets we're trying to assess, and we have our dashboard from our agent tool, whether it's our scan tool or EDR or whatever, and there's a discrepancy somewhere, we know something's missing an agent. That affects our score. We're not trying to look at just the results from that agent. We're looking at scoring or assessing, hey, this application has 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 servers that are actually missing the agent that we're expecting to have on there. So we know we're missing data. So we're not just calculating what are the findings from that agent. We're talking about when was the last time that agent reported in? When was the last time that application or that whatever was scanned? If it can't have an agent, maybe we need to be scanning it regularly. But our scan data shows that it wasn't scanned in the past 3 months. That raises our actionable risk score. And again, all these things are being added on top of each other so we can start to see where the risks are. And ultimately, what we're taking action, we're doing comparisons. We're not trying to look at dollar values. You can do comparisons by dollar value. Obviously, 10 million is more than 5 million. But if you have this standardized methodology, you can start looking at everything from a comparison standpoint, starting with that base risk. In theory, if you've done your business continuity planning or business impact analysis correctly, your base risk is going to line up with that perfectly. But what you may find is that you've calculated a base risk score and something you thought was less important is showing up really high on that base risk side. Maybe it's because once you've established this, you realize that that application had more exposure than you expected. You thought it only had 5 ports exposed externally, but it really has 30. So you need to reduce that base risk. You need to close those ports out so there's less access to the application. Or maybe it's exposed externally when it shouldn't be. Again, you're getting this data not because you did a survey on it, because you're looking at the data from your results. You're seeing that we know that this application is active on this server, and this server has an open path to the internet for someone to talk into, and it's not supposed to. We missed that. We were doing configurations, and we forgot to close that. So you're comparing applications to each other as opposed to just looking at the numbers that they provide. And same thing on the actionable side. And you can decide how much risk are we willing to accept for each of these applications. When we talk about actionable risk, we got the different numbers on there. Maybe a high-risk application only has 30 risk points available to it. So we need to make sure we get that actionable risk number down below 30. And we know what goes into that number, so now we can figure out, we can prioritize. We can say, what's impacting this number the most? Because everything's now been combined. We're not trying to confuse scan results with EDR results. We know all of these things work in a specific way, and we can combine those into an overall score and then prioritize. So that's, it's a huge benefit to be able to say, these are applications, this is where they score, and here's what we need to do. And the more you tie this together, the more you can find the overlap between the different applications. You can say, well, if we fix this one router here, we upgrade it to or close these ports down, then we've eliminated risk across 3 different applications. Yeah. So once we have that acceptable score, then that's where that critical risk comes in. And again, everything is scored in the way that makes sense for you. I mean, critical vulnerabilities from scanners probably going to be rated fairly high, but again, you may have certain tools, you may not have tools. And you can actually take into account that if you don't have a tool yet, you want to score it a certain way because you know you're missing something. So we got a little bit of time left for Q&A once we close up here. So the key takeaways I want to do here is that an asset just isn't something in the environment. It's the whole process. Again, if you've done business continuity planning, this is a key point to it. And then what you're missing is just as important. And again, this is not, we don't know what we don't know. This is, we know we haven't deployed something effectively across our environment. We're missing some data somewhere else. We don't have this agent installed. This network's not being scanned by our vulnerability scanner. This software application is not going through our normal SDLC process. All of these things are creating risk for you that you haven't even been able to measure. And if you're not including those factors in there, you're not quantifying all the aspects of it because you don't know what data it contains. You know you're supposed to have it, but you don't have it. And then lastly, this is a very continuous process. So ideally, you have the first time you do this, you may go through an Excel spreadsheet. You're going to put in all the numbers, figure out what variables you want, you're going to get that. But ultimately, you need an application that's going to do this. Whether you built it in-house or whether you go buy it from a third party, something that you need to do. And as you're building this process, make sure, and if you're going to use a third party, make sure you're talking to that third party, understanding what values that they're putting into their models. Don't blindly accept what they're saying. If they're saying that, well, we calculate that this vulnerability is an 80% chance of likelihood, ask them why they came up with that number. Is this from honeypots? Where are you getting this from? How are you integrating different sources of data? It's very important that you trust the data that's coming in so you can communicate that trust upward to your decision makers because they're the ones who have to trust what you say. If it feels to them like you're pulling this number out of nowhere, they're not going to believe you or they're not going to want to make those changes. It has to be full business buy-in for the process. And once they understand the process, they're going to believe the process. They're going to understand why you need to make certain decisions. And they can decide then whether to accept it or not, whether we need to buy a tool, whether we need to change something. Once they've bought into the quantification process, then they can make those decisions. And they know it's not based on some guess, that it's based on a methodology that you've applied across the environment. Whether it's to the different applications, the different application owners. Everyone can see, everyone is on the same page. And from there, you can make a proper risk decision. So we've got some resources here. I think these slides are going to be available online. You can check out any of these sources, talk about what cyber risk quantification is, different methodologies you can use. But with that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those now.
Yep, in the back. We do have some colleagues online, so we do need to use the microphone for all Q&A.
So the process you described seems to incorporate data coming in from operational tools, right? So that's not going to work for assessing and quantifying risk for a system that hasn't been in production for some time, right? You don't have that operational data coming in. Are there any standards or frameworks that you could extend, say, a stride threat model in order to quantify the risk coming out of that? Like, I agree with you about FAIR, like I've tried to use that to extend, but it's still just a qualitative assessment at the end of the day, you're guessing, right? Are there other lighter weight frameworks that you can use to extend a threat model to be able to quantify risk prior to an asset going into operation?
So part of the process would be to, are you assuming that the application is already in production, it hasn't gone through whatever process you've designed since then?
No, the opposite. It hasn't gone into production.
Okay, so it hasn't gone into production yet. Yep. So, yeah. Okay, so you're talking about when it hasn't, you're looking at something still in development. How do I quantify the risk that before it goes in development? There's nothing to say you can't use a similar process here. You know what the application is expected to have, so you can kind of pre-quantify that base risk based on what you know it's supposed to be. And in fact, when it goes operational, it's a good check to see, did we quantify this correctly? Did we take in all the variables that we expected to have, and when we applied it, did we get to that result? So I mean, something going into production, it should still go through the same basic checks. You know, those servers still have the same vulnerabilities associated with them. You know, they may be further in, so maybe you can take that production, before it's pre-production, you can have it as a pre-production application and has a base risk there, but once it goes production, the base risk is gonna change to whatever the production environment is. So you can still, again, it's a standardized process, whether it's in production or not, it's the same process. If you want to include those development servers, development databases in whatever model you use, you know, hopefully as a pre-production application, it's got a low risk score because it's not exposed, because it has these controls in place, because it's small, there's no real data associated with it. It has a smaller overall risk footprint. And then you can, when you put it into production, it goes into your existing model. So it's still an ongoing process. You can still fit it in there once you've established what your model is going to be. And again, I don't have all the answers for which numbers to apply where, because it's going to depend on the application or depend on how your business is structured, what's going to be more important to you than others. And the income value of an asset is going to vary greatly across different businesses.
Other questions? All right, well, Corey, thank you so much. To follow up
I
on...
think it's an early lunch.
No, keep going, keep going.
everybody
Corey did a great job. He did a great job. To follow up on what Corey said, the presentations are available on demand. You just log in to the MWise portal using your credentials, and you'll be able to see the recordings there and grab any screenshots of slides or anything that you want there. If you have any questions, let me know. You are welcome to head to lunch, and then remember that our keynotes are at 2 o'clock. Don't forget to take that survey, and if you didn't get scanned, be sure to do that now. Thanks for joining, team.